The Leopard 2 is a classic German tank, very similar to other Western tanks like the British Challenger 2 and the American Abrams, but very different from Russian tanks, which it's facing in Ukraine. It is a very sophisticated, very complex weapon system. Has a fantastic engine, the MTU, lots of power. It has a very good main armament, 120 millimeter smooth bore that can knock tanks out up to 2 to 3 kilometers. And it has some good armor to protect it against other tanks firing at it. However, when you look at it, the Russian tanks tend to be much smaller, have much less armor, a slightly different gun. But the key difference between Western tanks and Russian tanks is numbers. There are 18 Leopard 2s in Ukraine, we understand at the moment, whereas the Russians have thousands and thousands of T-72s, T-80s, T-90s, and they have lost thousands and thousands. So one for one, a Leopard 2 is vastly superior to Russian tanks. However, the Leopard 2 is the classic story of the German tank design, really going back to the Second World War. Many people, even those who haven't studied the Second World War in great detail, will have heard of the Tiger tank. This was the amazing German tank, very sophisticated, great gun, very mobile, but there were very, very few of them built. And ultimately, that's why the Germans lost the Second World War, because they ran out of tanks. Whereas the Allies, in particular, using the American Sherman tank, the Allies had 60,000 tanks, and the Germans only had 1,000 Tigers. And although the Tiger would account for maybe 5 or 6 Western tanks, ultimately they were defeated by mass. And that is the sort of the Leopard 2 story that we're seeing roll out in Ukraine at the moment. They are too few. Mass of manpower, mass of tanks is still critical. And that's been a lesson that we've forgotten, that we're relearning again in Ukraine. What the Leopard 2 was designed for, the Cold War, it was perfect. It was very robust, very mobile, and generally very reliable. However, what the Ukraine war has shown us is that things have changed, and the Leopard 2 has not been able to change quickly. One of the things that the leaked report coming out of the German Defense Ministry is saying is that it's very, very difficult to repair these tanks because they have to be taken hundreds of miles away from the battlefield. They need expert engineers from the German Rheinmetall company who made the tanks. And it's not like your car. If the engine stops, you can tinker around with it and do something. In fact, I remember when I was a young tank commander in an old British tank called the Chieftain tank, you could open up the bonnet, as it were, and there are lots of things you could do to make the tank work if it wasn't working. But with a Leopard 2, you can't. It's a sealed system. So the only way to repair the engine is to take it out and take it back to the factory. That is the complexity. And when anything else goes wrong, has a lot of electronic circuits that if they go wrong, you just can't, you can't keep fighting. The tank will not be able to fire. And that's what's been found out. And the other element to this is the new threats. So the drones, which are, ubiquitous, thousands of them, millions of them around, have the ability, some of them so small, carrying a hand grenade, can sort of fly through hatches and destroy these million-pound tanks. It's what we call top attack. The top of the tank traditionally has been the least protected because they were designed to take direct fire from another tank. This is the same issue they had in the First World War with the very first tanks, at the very first tank battle of Cambrai in 1917. The Germans were throwing what were called sticky bombs or hand grenades onto the top of the first tanks and destroying them in the same fashion that drones are destroying Leopard 2s and Western tanks on the current battlefield. Now, in the First World War, they put sort of chicken wire on top of the tanks to deflect these hand grenades. And what we're seeing slowly developing in Ukraine is cages being put on top of tanks to protect them. But it is a real vulnerability that the Leopards have not been able to keep up with. So although the design flaws were not apparent when these tanks were designed in the 70s and 80s, they are very much coming to the fore. And it goes back to this mass problem. You know, if you have thousands of Russian tanks and you lose a few to drones, then it's not such an issue. But if you only have a few, like they do with Leopard 2, and you lose a few, you lose a lot of your force. So those are the issues. The design flaws are now being apparent because actually the warfare and the weapons being used have changed, and they can't change. The tanks can't change quickly enough at the moment to make themselves safe. So the other element of this report is these tanks are just being used as sort of high-priced artillery pieces rather than what they were designed for, is to kill other tanks. I think what Ukraine is doing is again, like the Russians, using mass drones to effect, because Ukraine is probably destroying far more Russian tanks with drones than Russian drones are destroying Ukraine tanks. What it does highlight is that the sophistication of Western tanks, that advantage does not overcome the lack of numbers. And there's an interesting parallel here, because the Germans and other NATO countries have also given much more numbers of the Leopard 1 tank, which was the generation before Leopard 2. So there are a few hundred of the Leopard 1s around. They're much older tanks. They're much more basic, but the Ukrainians are saying they're more effective because they can repair them on the battlefield. They're more numerous, and hence can be more effective. So it would be better, I expect, for Western countries to give Ukraine more basic, older tanks in greater numbers than just a few very sophisticated and capable ones. So that, I think, is the lesson, and it goes back again to numbers. And we've seen that with manpower. The Russians seem to have an endless supply of conscripts that they're prepared to throw into the battle, which, you know, to our Western minds just seems, you know, unbelievable that the Russians and Putin is prepared to sacrifice so many people in the battlefield. But those numbers of tanks that the Russians have, the numbers of conscripts that they have, really is keeping them in a battle that perhaps they should have lost some time ago, and they would have lost. And the other, I think, key lesson to come out of this Challenger Leopard 2 tank issue is we were too slow in the West to give Ukraine these tanks. If we'd given many more of them, you know, as soon as the Russians invaded, rather than wait a year or 2 years to give them, they might be in a slightly different position. So I think that is the key element there. I'm sure Ukraine will keep using its old Soviet Russian tanks that it's got, and the West should perhaps dig into its sort of stores of older, what we think are less sophisticated tanks, would actually might be more effective on the battlefield than the latest technology that we're putting into tanks at the moment. Drones are so cheap now, and a drone that can carry an explosive over, say, 3 or 4 kilometers, you can buy for a few $100s. And so if you have thousands and thousands of them, they're very, very difficult to intercept. Now, traditionally, you would shoot these drones down. And if there are only 1 or 2 of them around, that is fine. And in the early part of this war, very expensive air defense missiles were being used that may cost $1 million, being used to take down a drone that costs $200. So, you know, that metric just doesn't add up. But when you can control these drones with AI, artificial intelligence, it sort of overwhelms the defensive capabilities of, you know, Ukrainian tanks and Western tanks. These tanks are pretty much unprotected unless they have a steel cage on top of them, which some of them do. It's relatively easy if hundreds of drones attack one tank, then one of them is eventually going to get through. So it's even the latest Leopard 2 tanks were designed in the 80s. They're now up against drones that were designed yesterday, sort of thing. So it's very difficult for them to keep up. And they will, no doubt, produce effective countermeasures for the drones. But at the moment, the drone is sort of leading the way and is being more effective. So we will see how it develops. But the tank is still being effective when it's been used in conjunction with what we call combined arms maneuver warfare, when it's supported with air power in particular. And that is a lesson that the Germans have said in this leak report, that without sufficient air power, the tanks are too exposed to drones. But also with working with infantry and artillery and its own drones, then that can counteract it. But a tank on its own, as it's ever been, even since the First World War, is very vulnerable.